So, having said all that and laid a foundation, how about a warm Linworth welcome for a wonderful Linworth member, Doug Riggle. Come on up, Doug. Doug, first things first, you've got a really exciting event coming up, an event that actually is tied to your story. So tell us about that event coming up.
Sure. So on the 29th of April, it's on a Sunday, so if you can make it to first service, you can make it out to our event. We're having our annual 5K walk run. I'm on the walk side of things these days, but it's a great time out at Hilliard-Davidson High School. We work and partner with the Hilliard-Davidson Band. Part of the proceeds go to help the kids there with new band instruments. Also helps Orphan World Relief, our orphanages around the world that we support, and our programs here in Central Ohio, working with foster care kids. It's a great time. It's a great time for the whole family. There's a kids run in advance. Kids can dress up as their favorite superhero. It's just a blast. I just encourage everyone to come. We have the tortilla truck going to be out there serving food, and a number of different vendors out there, and a number of organizations out there to kind of make the day, the afternoon kind of fun and exciting for everyone involved. So hope you can make it.
That's exciting. And the church is a part of sponsoring it. And again, Doug's organization is called Orphan World Relief. And we are so happy to partner with you, Doug, in that. So, well, Doug, let's start off. You have some really interesting thoughts on this. In general, why are stories so compelling?
So stories are... and this is obviously a big God thing to me. Stories are an amazing thing that He has given us for each other. And so I've English major back in college, and I did a lot of my favorite subjects were anything before the 12th century. And back in that time, there were a group of Anglo-Saxons called the Shopes, and their whole thing was to go around and tell stories. And they developed ways of, and each culture in the world at this time were doing the same thing. They developed ways of telling stories that could be repeated over and over again. Before the written word was, we had these stories, and they've repeated them, and they had great ways of memorizing them so they could be passed from generation to generation, so the story stayed intact pretty much. So I love that aspect of it. There's also a physiological aspect of things when you tell stories, and it's been great because I get to teach this to the different executives that I work with at the company I'm working for right now. Storytelling is a great way, if you want to get someone's attention, tell a story. And so there's two things that happen to the listener when you tell a story. So I'm about to teach you how to manipulate someone, if you didn't know it. So don't take this the bad way, but it's a great way to get people's attention. When you tell a story and you develop conflict in that story, the story can be just a minute long or 2 minutes long. That conflict automatically causes your listener's body to produce cortisol, which is the stress hormone. It adds belly fat. So I've been listening to a few stories lately. It also causes the brain to focus, which is really cool. So you tell a story, you build conflict. Now you've got the listener focused on what you're saying. When you resolve that story with a good ending to it, everything works out happily ever after, whatever it happens to be, their body then produces dopamine, which is feel-good hormone. It makes your body feel great. So you've done two things. You've got them focused on you, and now they're feeling good and happy about what you're about to say. So it keeps the door open for your testimony, keeps the door open for the gospel message. Storytelling, I always encourage people, even if you're giving a presentation at work, start with a story. And that gets people's attention right away.
Yeah, that's good. And so there must be something, too, again, the way that God wired our brain
certainly
to be a part of that process. So, Doug, you were telling me that in terms of your communicating your story about Christ, that this became very clear to you actually on a mission trip. So tell us about that.
So this is our very first trip to Italy. Mike and I were mission co-directors back in the day, and we're headed over there. And we planned this event at the hotel we were staying at. Christine Kimball was short back then, was going to give a concert, and I was going to get up and share my testimony. And I got up and started sharing my testimony. Interestingly enough, my interpreter, who became a really wonderful friend of mine, Giuseppe, he stopped me while I was telling my story. He's like, I remember that when that happened. I'm like, you're supposed to be interpreting for me in Italian, not. But it worked out well, and it was just a really good way, and it really confirmed to me that the stories have international appeal. Stories are there for everyone, and I learned at that point in time that my story needed to be told, and I needed to tell it multiple different ways. And Mike and I did a great job, and Mike and Dale did that today. Of here's 100 verses that are going to help you walk through the Bible and share your testimony with people. But also what's important is your testimony. You need to add that to it, so you need to be good at telling your story.
Yeah. And Doug, talk about, it's helpful to think about your story so you can communicate it clearly. Talk about that a little bit.
Right, so you never know how much time you've got with someone. When you're talking about your testimony, you may be in an elevator ride for 3 floors, or you may be on a road trip somewhere with someone where you've got hours to have a conversation. What I've learned is that my story, when I tell my testimony, and you'll hear a little bit of it later on today, I've learned to be able to be concise and give it quickly. I've learned to bring it out longer. Oddly enough, now this isn't true for everyone's testimony, mine's a weird one. Hollywood made a movie about the events surrounding my story. It wasn't my story, but the events surrounding my story. And so I've used that as a springboard to share as well. It was a movie called The Flood, Who Would Save Our Children, back in the 90s that they produced. Hollywood actually made it in Australia, which is kind of strange. But yeah, so it's just a great way. The parts of the story that are relevant depend on that person in that moment in time.
Yeah, and so you talked about being able to adapt your story to really the needs of the listener. So it's not just you sort of giving your story in a monotone way with no awareness of the needs and the questions of the listener, but you being so familiar with your story, what God did, that you're able to adapt it to the needs of the moment, the needs of that person.
Exactly.
Yeah, that's good. Doug, in your workshop, many people say to you, and I'm sure many of you are thinking this right now, my story is not very interesting or compelling, so why would anybody listen to it? What do you say to that?
So that's a very common question. You may have grown up in the church. Your parents brought you to church every day or every Sunday, maybe Wednesday night prayer meeting, and you just evolved into becoming a Christian. Probably a bad choice of words, evolved, but you know what I mean. You over time you realize this is right, this is true. Here, 2 things. Number 1, God's going to put people in your life who need to hear that. They may have had the same experience, but they didn't make that pivot point and say, I'm going to follow Christ. They just said, you know what, this isn't for me. And they may need to hear about your specific story. But every day, too, we make decisions to follow Christ. There are always pivot points in every day of my life, at least, I'm hopefully not alone in this, that I make decisions that I'm going to do the right thing and follow Christ. I'm going to do the right thing and follow Christ. Those are just as important along the way as your personal testimony. And being able to share that with others as well is just as important.
Yeah, you may be, in a work context, and so for someone who's married, you may be in a work context and marriage might come up, and you might have a 30-second opportunity to talk about how God or how Christ has helped you in your married life. And again, that can be just a very cogent thing, because that's something that God has done. And of course, we want to share our stories as well. But all those things, just being aware that we can talk about how God's working and in many, many parts of our lives. Doug, let's do a shameless promotion here. We decided this week that it'd be great for you to do your workshop. Can you just talk a little bit about your workshop?
Sure. So in the workshop, we're going to do a condensed version of the Bible study that I wrote before. But you're going to come out of that with a good draft, hopefully, of your personal testimony. One of the things, whenever I start teaching this, I always talk about what a wonderful vision it would be if to walk into a church, any church, and to see a wall lined with individual testimony tracts. You see people's faces that go to that church. You know at that point you're walking into a church of changed lives. That's what it's all about. Jesus Christ stepped into each of these people's lives in a very different and unique way, yet they're all here. They're all here to celebrate and to worship God.
Yeah. Amen. Okay, so check that out. Finally, as a model, to model for you the power of stories, I've asked Doug to share his. So,
sure. So, Sharing in a group obviously is different than sharing individually one-on-one. And one of the things I'll say is I can pull from different aspects of my background, where I was at the time before I accepted Christ. I grew up and went to church sporadically. I can't think of periodically. There we go. I went to church periodically. Yeah. Sporadically, that's the word. Yeah. With neighbors of mine. I remember going to church one time in my grandparents' hometown of Athens and my great aunt's family in Virginia. But that was it. I didn't have any exposure to it. What I did have exposure to was a lot of New Age thinking that was in play at the time, back in the 70s and 80s. And also, sort of the aspect of my life I may bring up is growing up, I was adopted, if you didn't know that. So I was adopted as an infant. And didn't know that my adopted father liked me, much less loved me, until way after my college years. So I was dealing with that and some abuse in the past as well. So any of those aspects I can bring up. All this coming forward to, I'd say this probably March of 87 is when the real, God really started impacting my life. Now, up until that point in college, I had been dating a woman. Her name was Gail. She was a Southern Baptist. Later on, I kind of got on her for being very unequally yoked. She had no reason dating me, but regardless, she would share Jesus with me. I would share Shirley MacLaine back at her, or I would share what I was reading back at her at the time. Shirley MacLaine was big back then. And we go back and forth. Well, I was also at this point, too, a very depressed young man. I never, because of my dad, because of a lot of different factors, abuse I'd had in the past, physical, sexual, I just always depressed, always down. And I woke up one Sunday morning, I'd fallen asleep with the TV on. I woke up, and there was a preacher on TV. And he was saying some of the same things that my girlfriend Gail was saying to me about Jesus and Jesus' love for me. And I just was so down, and one quick little prayer: God, if this is true, show me. Now, fast forward, during the spring of that year, I worked as an intern for the American Red Cross in South Texas. And my internship had ended, and I was at work. I worked at Lackland Air Force Base, and I was at work there, and I got a call from the Red Cross in July saying, hey, there's been an accident in Comfort, Texas, a little town northwest of San Antonio. Can you come down and take the place? I was a media liaison as an intern, and they had no one who can go there for that spot. So I said, sure, I'll go down. They're like, pack a bag. You're going to probably stay 3 days until we can find someone to replace you. No problem. So I drove up to Texas, up to Comfort, Texas, and to make a very long story short, there had been an accident. So in the Texas Hill Country, when it rains, the flooding downstream is horrible, fast, rapid, and does a lot of damage. A school bus and a van full of a lot of high school kids and of some adults were leaving a Christian camp. I found out it was a Christian camp later on. They were all believers. They were leaving that Christian camp to head back home when their van and bus got hit by a wall of water and washed kids and adults into what was a small stream, became a torrential river. And the sound of that river, if you've ever been to Niagara Falls and hear the sound of those falls, that's what that river sounded like to me. And water does, trust me, a lot of damage. When I got there, there were kids missing. They were having search parties everywhere. There were kids in a small elementary school. That's where we had a temporary shelter set up. I got there. The kids still had no clothes. The kids got some robes from local neighbors, but the water had ripped the clothes from their bodies. And so they were scared. They were frightened. They don't know what happened to a lot of their friends. Their family had just started showing up. Their family was pretty far north. There was a airline that was flying all the family down from near Dallas, Texas. It was about an 8-hour flight or 8-hour drive. So they were all flying there. And that's what I walked into. And I got there, and there are a lot of different stories I could tell about this experience. This was 3 days of my life. One of the young men I was talking to in the hallway, he was explaining to me about how he got saved. You know, he got rescued, not spiritually saved, but rescued. And he said, I got washed downstream. It's like I couldn't feel anything. I couldn't see anything. I was just being turned over end on end. It's like I finally grabbed onto a log. And that log was floating. And it's like I could get my nose above water till I could breathe. So after a while, he said, the water started calming down. drink. Speaking of water. The water started calming down, and he realized he could put his feet on the shore. Finally, he could actually see what was going on, got his feet on the shore, looked up, and he wasn't holding onto a log. He was holding onto the leg of a deer, and the deer had swum and saved his life. Another young man named John Bankston. He, football player. He was someone probably I never would have been friends with back in high school. I was well, still am a geek. But big, strong guy, and he rescued the lives of 3 of his fellow students. One guy had broken his leg at the camp, and he carried it on his shoulders, put him ashore, went back towards the bus to rescue one girl in a tree, let go of that tree, went downstream, rescued someone else in a tree. They never found John again. He gave his life rescuing his friends. There's one more lady, I'll tell you the story. So I was getting ready to leave on the 3rd day, and she was sitting out there just reading. I didn't realize she was reading her Bible at the time. She was reading her Bible, and I knew that she had lost both of her sons. They'd already been found. They'd already been declared dead. Her only 2 kids. And I asked her, I said, do you want me to arrange for you to go home and to, fly back to your hometown? And she's like, no. She's like, and she's looked at me, and she had just a weak smile on her face. She's like, I'm not going to leave until the last child's found. The love that these people had for one another was not from this world. I sat across the breakfast table that morning of John Bankston's father, who had not been found, and the bus driver. And the media were there descending like locusts on the situation. And out in the media was being told that it was the bus driver's fault, why these kids were dead. And I watched the bus driver and John's dad just embrace each other and cry and offer forgiveness to each other and love. It's a love I'd never seen before. This is how this is part of my story of how I became a believer. And it's just an amazing thing that kind of love to me existed. And it's interesting. So I didn't tell this first service. After that, I went home. I accepted Christ. I was praying all the way home, and ended up 3 months later moving back to Ohio, and hadn't been to a church. And friends of mine that I was friends with from high school, I didn't know she was a believer. She didn't know I was a believer. She invited me to her church. I'm like, yeah, I need to go to church. And the very first teaching I heard was they were talking about Genesis. They were talking about Enoch. And Enoch walked with God, and he was no more, because God took him. And all I could think of is John Bankston. And he walked with God. He saved 3 lives, and he was no more. And that's how I became a believer.
Thank you. Thank you. How about a round of applause for Doug?